Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Whether you're in bed, on a long journey, or just winding down for the night, this video is for you. If you enjoy relaxing, informative content like this, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps us create more content to help you drift off peacefully. And while you're here, drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. We love hearing from our global community. Now, let's journey into one of the most important and surprisingly bizarre chapters in history. In the tranquil moments before the largest amphibious invasion in human history, few could have imagined the peculiar, haunting, and at times downright surreal moments that would define D-Day. But to understand why June 6, 1944 became so vital and so strange, we must first look at the geopolitical world that led to that day. World War II was not just a war of weapons, but of ideologies, blunders, and increasingly desperate tactics. After the fall of France in 1940, Hitler believed his European fortress was complete, but the Allied powers were biding their time, planning their strike. Operation Overlord, the code name for the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, didn't begin as a masterstroke of military genius. In fact, early versions of the plan were chaotic, uncoordinated, and often absurd. There were debates about whether they should land in the Pas-de-Calais region, which was the most direct route across the English Channel, or gamble on the beaches of Normandy. The Germans, too, assumed any logical attack would happen at Calais. But the Allies had something else in mind. Behind the scenes, British and American generals wrestled with the logistics of moving thousands of ships, vehicles, and over 150,000 troops across rough seas. It wasn't just a matter of power, it was a matter of deception. Enter Operation Bodyguard, one of the most bizarre and elaborate deception strategies in military history. To confuse German forces about the true location of the landings, the Allies created fake armies using inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and false radio signals. They even employed a dead body, dressed as a British officer, holding a briefcase of falsified invasion plans, and let it wash ashore in Spain, where Nazi spies were expected to find it. This was called Operation Mincemeat, and believe it or not, it worked. German High Command shifted resources to defend a location that would never be attacked. Meanwhile, strange alliances were forming. The United States collaborated with resistance movements across France, airdropping supplies and training partisans in sabotage and intelligence gathering. In Britain, engineers were designing bizarre new vehicles, floating tanks, underwater pipelines, and even fire-spitting armored bulldozers to ensure the beach assault wouldn't fail. As the date of invasion approached, the weather turned against the Allies. Storms and rough seas delayed the operation by 24 hours, causing a nerve-wracking pause that left commanders, soldiers, and political leaders teetering between anxiety and resolve. A single meteorologist, James Stagg, had the unenviable task of predicting the weather window. Based on his recommendation, General,
Eisenhower gave the order, "Okay, let's go." And so it began. At 6:30 a.m. on June 6th, Allied troops stormed 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. What followed was a chaotic blend of heroism, horror, and the unexpected. Omaha Beach, in particular, was a bloodbath where American troops met fierce German resistance. Landing craft were ripped apart by machine guns before they even reached the shore. Soldiers drowned under heavy gear, and missed landings threw entire units into disarray. But even in the midst of this violence, strange stories emerged. A bagpiper named Bill Millen walked up and down Sword Beach playing his bagpipes, entirely unarmed, as bullets whizzed by him. German snipers reportedly held their fire, assuming no sane person would do such a thing during a battle. Then there was the use of dummy paratroopers, life-sized dolls filled with straw, dropped behind enemy lines to confuse and distract the German forces. These decoys came equipped with small firecrackers to mimic gunfire and were codenamed Rupert. And perhaps most bizarre of all, a British officer named Major Digby Tatham Water went into battle wielding an umbrella and wearing a bowler hat, claiming it was easier to identify himself to his troops. He later used the umbrella to knock out a German vehicle driver through the slit of an armoured car. D-Day was not merely the start of the liberation of Europe. It was a testament to human unpredictability in the face of terror. It was a collision of strategy, improvisation, and outright madness. As we continue this series, we'll go deeper into the strange tactics, forgotten heroes, inexplicable mistakes, and overlooked stories that made D-Day a moment in history unlike any other. As the assault on Normandy was being finalized, the war's strangest battlefront took shape not on the beaches, but in the realm of illusion. bullets hit sand, the Allies had already deployed one of their most effective secret weapons, phantoms, known officially as the Ghost Army. This special unit was made up of artists, sound engineers, and illusionists. Their mission: to deceive the German military by creating the illusion of massive Allied forces where none existed. Their tools included inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and pre-recorded sounds of entire divisions moving through countryside roads. This wasn't a sideshow. The Germans were obsessed with tracking Allied movements by intercepting radio signals and watching for signs of military buildup. So the Ghost Army gave them something to see: rubber tanks from a distance, painted canvas facades of aircraft, and troop movements simulated by dragging loudspeakers through the night air, blasting sounds of engines, boots, and even shouted commands. They even drove in loops through towns wearing different unit patches to suggest multiple divisions had arrived. One man could impersonate several regiments in a single afternoon. These operations were not only bizarre, they were dangerous. If captured, these artists and sound technicians had no combat training. They relied on the illusion being so convincing that Germans wouldn't risk checking it up close. Meanwhile, deeper in the heart of Europe, another deception was unfolding. This one played out through
invisible ink, double agents, and code names. One of the most successful Allied spies was a man named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. He convinced the Nazis he had a network of spies feeding him Allied secrets. In reality, every report he sent back to Germany was invented by the British. Garbo provided German high command with inside information that confirmed their beliefs, that the real invasion would be at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. He even convinced them to keep elite German units in the wrong location for weeks after the Normandy invasion began. But not all of the deception was so subtle. One of the most haunting parts of the D-Day preparation was Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable. These were staged invasions. Fleets of small boats towing radar-reflecting balloons meant to trick German radar into thinking an armada was sailing toward Norway and Calais. As night fell, bombers dropped metal strips called window, which reflected radar signals and made it look like fleets were on the move. From the German perspective, it seemed they were being attacked from multiple directions. The Allies weren't just invading a coastline, they were attacking reality itself. Even the timing of the invasion was dictated not by strategy alone, but by the moon and tides. June 6th was selected because of a rare convergence. a full moon to help pilots navigate and paratroopers land, and a low tide at dawn to expose underwater obstacles. If the invasion didn't happen on that narrow window, they'd have to wait another 2 weeks. And the longer they waited, the more likely it was that the Germans would uncover the truth. The tension was unbearable. Soldiers were loaded onto ships, only to be told the operation was delayed due to storms. Some were unloaded, others remained at sea, seasick and anxious for hours or days, unsure when or if they would be called into action. The secrecy was so intense that many commanders were not told the full plan until hours before launch. Even within the highest ranks, confusion reigned. In the lead up to the landings, German commanders themselves were hesitant to act without direct orders from Hitler, who had taken a sleeping pill and was not to be disturbed. The night before the landings, paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped into the dark behind enemy lines. But their drop zones were chaotic. Many landed miles from their objectives. Some drowned in flooded fields. Others found themselves alone in the French countryside, surrounded by enemy patrols, unsure where they even were. And yet, this chaos often worked in their favor. German forces couldn't figure out where the main attack was happening. Reports of scattered landings, small groups of Americans popping up everywhere, and bizarre sounds of tanks and armies that didn't exist only deepened the confusion. In war, knowledge is power. And in the hours before D-Day, the Allies made sure the enemy knew all the wrong things. What makes these tactics so bizarre isn't just their creativity, it's their success. The Germans, despite years of preparation, were thrown off balance not by superior numbers, but by a carefully orchestrated illusion. And in the end, the illusion became reality. At dawn, the real invasion began. As the first light of June 6th broke across the English Channel, it revealed an unprecedented sight. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft surging toward the beaches of Normandy. It was a seaborne armada, unlike anything seen before or since. Destroyers, battleships, troop transports, floating docks, and supply vessels stretched to the horizon, shrouded in sea mist and nerves. Each of the 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, had a different terrain, different defenders, and a different story. But what united them was chaos. At Utah Beach, the Americans were actually blown off course by strong currents, landing about 2,000 yards south of their intended location. Ironically, this turned out to be a stroke of luck. The spot they landed was less heavily defended. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the only general to land in the first wave, looked around, realized the error, and simply said, "We'll start the war from here." His decision to press on rather than regroup likely saved hundreds of lives. Omaha Beach, however, was a different story. It would become the bloodiest of the 5 landings. Allied intelligence had underestimated German fortifications and overestimated the effectiveness of the pre-invasion bombardment. The bombers had missed. The naval artillery had done little. American troops stepped out of their landing craft into a nightmare. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery opened fire on them the moment the ramps dropped. Many soldiers were killed before they could reach the shore. Some drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others never made it out of the boats at all. The tide was coming in. The beach was lined with obstacles, wooden posts, steel hedgehogs, mines and barbed wire, all designed to funnel soldiers into killing zones. Those who did survive the initial landing had to crawl forward under fire with no cover and no clear idea of where their units were. The radios failed. Commanders were dead or missing. Medics treated wounds with seawater and gauze, dragging the injured out of the surf with sheer force. Boats kept coming, depositing more soldiers into a storm of lead and steel, and yet they pressed on, one by one. Small squads found cracks in the German defenses. Engineers blew gaps in the barbed wire. A few men scaled the cliffs and neutralized gun nests. Progress was measured in yards, won by inches. On Gold Beach, British forces faced a more measured resistance. But what made Gold unique was the presence of specialized armored vehicles known as Hobart's Funnies, strange machines designed for peculiar battlefield problems. Some were tanks that laid bridges, others flailed chains to detonate mines, and one bizarre model, known as the Crocodile, shot bursts of flame to clear bunkers. These contraptions might have looked like something out of a science fiction film, but they were instrumental in pushing inland. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops encountered high tides that left them landing directly into German fire with little room to maneuver. The initial casualties were severe, worse even than Omaha in the first hour. But the Canadians fought ferociously, breaking through the seawall and moving deeper into the countryside than any other Allied force that day. Sword Beach, on the eastern flank, saw British troops storm ashore with a mix of military precision and bewildering obstacles. Tanks bogged down in soft sand. Bridges were blown before engineers could reach them. In the chaos, one soldier even brought his pet terrier with him, carrying the dog through waist-high water. And then there were the French civilians, caught in the middle of the invasion. In towns near the beaches, some residents sheltered in basements while others tried to flee on bicycles. Entire villages were pulverized by naval artillery or bombers. In one instance, a village was liberated by British forces in the morning, retaken by a German counterattack in the afternoon, and then re-liberated by nightfall. Back at sea, confusion still reigned. Friendly fire incidents occurred. A US Navy destroyer nearly opened fire on Canadian troops, mistaking them for the enemy. Commanders had to improvise constantly, rewriting battle plans mid-action. And then came the floating harbours, mulberries. These were colossal portable docks, dragged across the channel and assembled off the coast of Normandy to allow rapid unloading of tanks, trucks and supplies. Building them was an engineering marvel. Keeping them together in stormy seas was a daily fight. When a massive storm struck on June 19th, it destroyed one of the harbours entirely, throwing Allied logistics into turmoil. All of this unfolded in a single day. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a fragile foothold. Thousands were dead, thousands more were wounded or missing. But against all odds, they held the beaches. It hadn't gone as planned, far from it, but the plan was never the point. The point was to overwhelm, to outmaneuver, and to persist. And in the confusion and horror of June the 6th, 1944, they had done just that. While the world's attention was fixed on the chaos of the beach landings, another war was unfolding inland, in the hedgerows, villages, and darkened skies above Normandy. This was the war of the paratroopers, the men who jumped from the night sky hours before the first boats reached the shore. 2 American airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, were dropped behind enemy lines in the early hours of June the 6th. Their mission was critical: seize bridges, block reinforcements, secure roadways, and create confusion in the German rear. But almost nothing went as planned. Navigational errors, unexpected weather, and dense fog caused entire plane loads of paratroopers to be scattered across miles of countryside. Some landed in flooded marshes and drowned under the weight of their gear. Others came down alone, miles from their units, with only the moonlight and the occasional burst of gunfire to orient them. And yet, this chaos worked to their advantage. German forces were overwhelmed by the disarray. Reports flooded in of Allied troops everywhere. But the reality was different. Small, isolated groups of Americans were fighting desperately to regroup, organize, and carry out their missions. Some of the most legendary tales from D-Day emerged from these airborne units. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry captured, then escaped, and returned to his unit days later. In another village, Lieutenant Dick Winters of Easy Company led a daring assault on a German artillery position near Brecourt Manor. His small force took out multiple enemy guns and dozens of soldiers, all with minimal casualties. The tactics he used that day are still studied at military academies around the world. But for many, D-Day night was pure improvisation. Lost paratroopers used whistles, clickers, and even bird calls to find each other. Sometimes they found friends. Other times, they walked straight into enemy ambushes. Farmhouses became temporary command posts. Cows were mistaken for enemy soldiers. In one reported case, an American soldier ordered a group of French livestock to surrender. The terrain didn't help. Normandy's bocage, thick hedgerows, and sunken lanes turned every field into a fortress. Visibility was near zero. Ambushes came from every direction, and communication was nearly impossible. Radios failed or were lost in the drops. Runners were often the only means of delivering messages. Despite these challenges, the paratroopers managed to seize vital bridges and disrupt German movements. One such bridge, known today as Pegasus Bridge, was taken by British glider troops in a silent, daring landing just minutes after midnight. Gliders, towed by bombers and then released to coast silently into fields near their objectives, crash-landed within yards of the target. It was one of the most precise airborne landings in military history. The Germans, for their part, were paralyzed by confusion. Field commanders struggled to verify reports. Some were convinced that the paratroopers were decoys for a larger force. Others hesitated to move troops without orders from above. And those orders weren't coming. The chaos wasn't only military. Civilians across Normandy woke to the sound of planes, gunfire, and explosions. Many had no idea what was happening. Some fled, others offered shelter to lost paratroopers. A few even picked up rifles and fought alongside them. In one village, an elderly French woman reportedly offered coffee to a group of American soldiers huddled in her barn. They had no idea where they were, but she pointed to a map and said, "You are liberators." It was the first time they realized the scale of what they were doing, and the scale was staggering. Thousands of paratroopers, many still teenagers, had leapt into the unknown. Most had never seen combat. Many had never even been to France. Yet they carried out missions under conditions more extreme than most planners could have imagined. For every successful objective seized, there were stories of tragedy. Entire sticks of paratroopers were shot in the air before they hit the ground. Gliders crashed into trees, walls, or each other. Some units were wiped out before they could fire a shot. Still, they fought on. By dawn, many had linked up with advancing beach forces. Others were still alone, holding crossroads, hiding in ditches, or defending barns and hedges from German counterattacks. And though their landings had been scattered, their impact was profound. They had sown panic, they had seized key positions, and most importantly, they had shown that the Germans were no longer in control of the
Night. The liberation of France had begun not with a flag, but with shadows falling from the sky. If you ask most people what decided the fate of D-Day, they'll say strategy, bravery, or firepower. But in truth, it was something far more unpredictable: the weather. In the days leading up to June 6th, the English Channel turned violent. Massive swells crashed against ships in port. Winds howled across airfields. Clouds blotted out the stars. The invasion, which had been meticulously planned for months, hung by a thread. And that thread was held by a single man, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist to General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Stagg was a soft-spoken Scotsman, leading a team of British and American forecasters who used rudimentary radar, sea reports, and experience to predict the unpredictable. The data was conflicting. One team said the weather would clear, another predicted disaster, and Stagg had to make the final call. He told Eisenhower that a brief window of calmer weather would open in the early hours of June 6th. It would be rough, but just good enough. Eisenhower made the call. Okay, let's go. And so, D-Day was launched on a prediction, a calculated gamble that could have spelled catastrophe had it been wrong. The decision is still considered one of the most courageous and bizarre moments of command in military history. It relied not on tanks or soldiers, but barometric pressure and cloud movement. But the weather would not be tamed so easily. In the hours before the landings, heavy clouds blinded Pathfinder planes. Some bombers dropped their payloads too early, missing targets entirely. Paratroopers were scattered again, and landing craft were battered by waves that turned coordinated arrivals into disorganized trickles. On Omaha Beach, landing craft were tossed so violently that many were swamped. Some soldiers never made it to shore. Others arrived too far east or west of their targets, forcing last-minute adjustments in a deadly storm of machine gun fire. Meanwhile, German defenders were watching the sky too. The bad weather had led them to believe that no invasion was possible. Many high-ranking officers were away from their posts. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man in charge of coastal defenses, had taken leave to celebrate his wife's birthday. He was in Germany when the invasion began. This irony has become legendary. Rommel, one of Germany's most brilliant tacticians, had begged Hitler to reinforce the beaches. He knew the invasion was coming soon, but even he was deceived by the clouds. He assumed the seas were too rough. he left. And when the invasion began, no one was there to coordinate a unified response. Worse still, Hitler himself was asleep. The German Führer had issued strict orders that no one was to wake him without cause. When reports of the invasion began to arrive, his aides hesitated. Several hours passed before he was informed, and longer still, before he gave permission to move critical reinforcements. In those crucial hours, the Allies gained ground, and yet weather continued to haunt the campaign. On June 19th, just 13 days after the landing, an enormous storm struck the coast. It was one of the worst channel storms in decades. The sea rose with fury. Wind tore through temporary docks. Waves destroyed landing craft and sank supply ships. The storm lasted 3 days and wreaked havoc on Allied logistics. One of the 2 massive Mulberry harbours, artificial ports constructed to unload supplies, was completely destroyed. The other was badly damaged. For a time, the Allied beachhead risked running out of ammunition and food. But this wasn't the only bizarre weather twist. Unknown to the Allies at the time, the Germans had tried to create their own forecasting system, one independent of the Allies' global network. They had limited access to Atlantic storm data, so when the storm hit, they were caught off guard. Their reinforcements were stranded. Communications were disrupted. Supply lines faltered. The weather, in a way, became a secret ally. But perhaps most strangely, the psychological effect of the weather cannot be overstated. Allied troops waded ashore through frigid water, fought in muddy fields, and slept in open foxholes while rain lashed them at night. Morale dipped, illnesses rose, and tempers frayed. Equipment rusted, boots rotted, trucks sank in fields turned to marsh. Yet they endured. One British officer noted in his journal, "We are not fighting the Germans anymore. We are fighting the wind, the mud, and the rain, and they are winning." But the Allies adapted. They built roads using metal mesh called Sommerfeld track to keep vehicles from bogging down. Engineers dug drainage trenches across the beaches and bivouacs. Medical units treated trench foot, pneumonia, and hypothermia as often as bullet wounds. Still, the psychological toll was immense. Young men, thousands of miles from home, lay soaked to the bone in unfamiliar hedgerows, waiting for battles to begin. In many cases, they never saw the enemy, just the fog, the drizzle, the shadows of trees that looked like soldiers in the mist. D-Day wasn't won in a day. And it wasn't just a battle against guns and bunkers. It was a battle against nature itself, fought on slippery decks, in clouded skies, and in mud that swallowed wheels whole. The weather had nearly undone the most ambitious military operation in history, but it hadn't, because when the clouds finally parted and the sun returned, the Allies were still there, bloodied, exhausted, half-starved, but moving forward. As the beaches were secured and Allied troops pushed inland, the strangeness of D-Day only deepened. In a war often remembered for tanks, bombers, and strategy, many of the most important victories came through ingenuity, luck, or sheer weirdness. Perhaps no figure better embodied this than Major Digby Tatham Water, a British officer who fought not on the beaches, but in the broader Normandy campaign following the invasion. Known for his eccentricity, Digby famously led troops into battle carrying an umbrella. Why? He said it was to avoid being mistaken for a German officer. Incredibly, he once disabled a German armored car by jabbing the umbrella through the slit and poking the driver in the eye. On the American side, Private Joseph Barrel's story is even stranger. He parachuted into Normandy as part of the 101st Airborne, was captured by the Germans, escaped multiple times, and eventually joined a Russian tank battalion. That's right. He fought with the Soviets after escaping a Nazi POW camp. He is believed to be the only American to have served in both the US and Soviet armies during the war. Not all bizarre tactics came from individuals. Some were institutional, and they were bold. One was the deployment of flail tanks, or crab tanks. These were modified Sherman tanks, with massive chains spinning in front, designed to detonate mines safely ahead of advancing troops. They looked absurd, like medieval battering rams, but they were effective. As they churned forward, the chains struck the ground with a furious rhythm, causing buried explosives to detonate harmlessly away from infantry. Then there were swimming tanks, Sherman tanks fitted with flotation screens and propellers designed to paddle ashore under their own power. Some worked, many didn't. At Omaha Beach, a large number of these DD tanks sank in the rough seas before reaching land, taking their crews with them. It was a daring experiment, but also a tragic one. Other innovations were slightly more surreal. Engineers built portable flamethrowers, not for assaulting bunkers, but for clearing brush and fields. The goal? Prevent German snipers from hiding in tall grass. The resulting charred earth was unpleasant, but effective, and added to the apocalyptic atmosphere of the Normandy countryside. Animals, too, played strange roles in the invasion. British troops famously brought paratrooper pigeons, used to carry messages if radios failed. Some birds flew dozens of miles across enemy territory to deliver critical intelligence. One, named Gustav, received the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, for delivering the first news of the landings back to Britain. Meanwhile, war dogs were used to sniff out mines and locate wounded soldiers. Horses pulled artillery in places where vehicles couldn't pass through the narrow, mud-choked roads of Normandy. Livestock wandered into battle zones, often panicked and unpredictable. In some cases, cows were used as improvised cover by advancing troops, a bizarre, desperate, and very real tactic in the hedgerow fighting. But perhaps the strangest tactics were psychological. In the days after D-Day, Allied forces broadcast recordings of fake troop movements through massive loudspeakers, hoping to confuse German patrols at night. The recordings included commands, engine sounds, and even fake conversations about phantom operations. It wasn't about firepower. It was about planting the idea that more troops were coming from everywhere. In occupied towns, Allied intelligence officers set up phony German radio stations to broadcast misinformation to Nazi troops. The goal was to sow mistrust, give false orders, or even encourage desertion. One of these stations aired jazz music banned by the Nazis, alongside propaganda designed to erode morale. And morale was indeed fragile. Many German troops had been stationed in France for months, even years, expecting a slow war. Their units were under strength, undersupplied, and often misinformed. Some were conscripts from Eastern Europe, barely trained and unfamiliar with German. Others were teenagers in Hitler Youth units, terrified and eager to surrender. On the Allied side, morale fluctuated wildly. Victories were often followed by heavy losses. Just witnessed horrors in the aftermath of battle. Bodies tangled in hedgerows, bombed out villages, wounded civilians. In some towns, local resistance fighters emerged to help, but their methods were sometimes brutal. Collaborators were shaved bald, paraded in the streets, or worse. The fog of war wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Soldiers questioned orders, debated tactics, and often found themselves making life or death decisions based on instinct alone. In such an environment, unlikely heroes emerged daily. Medics who ran through open fields to save the wounded, engineers who built bridges under fire, signalers who restored communications with pocket knives and scrap wire, chaplains who crawled between dying men to offer comfort, and countless unnamed privates who fought not for glory, but for survival and for each other. And so, In the days following June 6th, the Normandy invasion became more than a military operation. It became a collection of strange stories, human resilience, and decisions made in moments of uncertainty. D-Day had begun with a plan, but its true success was written in improvisation, in bizarre machines, brave individuals, and tactics no war college could have taught. Beyond the beaches and battlefields, another war raged in the shadows. A war of resistance, sabotage, and silent defiance. For years leading up to D-Day, French resistance fighters had been gathering intelligence, relaying coded messages, and preparing for the moment when Allied boots would return to French soil. When the signal finally came, cryptic phrases broadcast over BBC radio, such as the long sobs of the violins of autumn, they knew it was time. Resistance groups across France sprang into action. They sabotaged train lines, cut telephone wires, destroyed bridges, and ambushed German convoys. Some even dressed as civilians, hiding weapons in bicycles or bread baskets. In some areas, they guided Allied paratroopers through unfamiliar terrain, acting as scouts and guides through the deadly bocage. Many were ordinary people, farmers, school teachers, teenagers. One of the youngest known resistance fighters was just 13 years old. Women played crucial roles too, serving as couriers, nurses, and leaders. They often moved freely under the radar of German patrols, carrying explosives in shopping bags and messages in loaves of bread. But the cost of resistance was enormous. The Germans responded with brutal reprisals. Entire villages were punished for the actions of a few. In Oradour-sur-Glane, SS troops massacred 642 civilians, men, women, and children, as retaliation for resistance activity nearby. The town was burned, and its ruins were left untouched after the war as a permanent reminder of Nazi terror. Still, the resistance did not stop. In fact, D-Day strengthened them. For the first time in years, they felt the war turning in their favor. Their efforts helped delay German reinforcements trying to reach the front. In some places, they took towns before Allied soldiers arrived. One resistance group even captured a key road junction by impersonating German officers, redirecting an entire convoy into an ambush. Meanwhile, in the towns and villages near the invasion zones, French civilians were caught in a whirlwind of liberation and destruction. Artillery, shells leveled homes. Airstrikes missed targets and hit schools. Roads were filled with wreckage, fleeing families, and the sounds of tanks rumbling past horse-drawn carts. Some civilians rushed to help the wounded, dragging Allied and German soldiers alike into cellars and barns. Others joined the fight. A famous example is Jeanne Le Herminier, who disguised herself as a nun and carried intelligence and first aid supplies between resistance cells under constant threat of execution. But not all civilians welcomed the Allies with open arms. Fear and uncertainty led to mixed reactions. In towns that had seen years of German occupation, some locals had collaborated with the enemy, willingly or under duress. After liberation, these collaborators faced brutal retribution from their neighbors. Some were executed. Others were paraded in public with their heads shaved, marked for shame. It was a time of both triumph and reckoning. In many cases, Allied troops witnessed this internal justice with discomfort. They had come to liberate, not to referee civil vengeance. But the emotions ran deep. For the French people, D-Day wasn't just a military event. It was the beginning of a personal and national reckoning. As the Allies advanced, they entered towns where Germans had lived for years, sometimes side by side with civilians. German language signs still hung on schools and shops. Propaganda posters adorned the walls. In some places, they found Nazi offices abandoned in haste, typewriters still warm, maps marked with invasion plans, coffee cups half full. In one surreal moment, American soldiers discovered a Gestapo office with a fully stocked wine cellar, complete with a phonograph still playing a Wagner record, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for lunch. But the true surrealism lay in the strange coexistence of war and daily life. Children still played in courtyards. Church bells rang. Farmers herded sheep across roads lined with tanks. In liberated towns, Allied soldiers shared chocolate and cigarettes with wide-eyed children who had only known war. Many soldiers described the moment not as a victory march, but as a quiet, emotional exchange between exhausted liberators and weary survivors. And amidst all this, rebuilding began immediately. Even as the fighting raged just miles away, villagers began clearing rubble, repairing roads, and reopening shops. Priests held masses for the dead in bombed-out cathedrals. Women returned to markets, baking bread and selling vegetables next to burned-out German vehicles. The spirit of survival was everywhere, and in this strange blend of destruction and rebirth, the true nature of D-Day's aftermath became clear. It wasn't just about toppling an enemy. It was about restoring life to a land that had been slowly suffocated for years. What began as a military operation had become a cultural, emotional, and spiritual reawakening. The flags that now flew in Normandy were not just symbols of victory. They were signs of return, of hope, of freedom whispered between neighbors. And for the first time in a long time, they were not afraid to speak aloud. As the dust settled and Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the mythology of D-Day began to take shape, shaped not only by history, but by rumor, propaganda, and misinformation. And the truth, as always, was far stranger than fiction. Let's begin with one of the most persistent myths, that D-Day went according to plan. It didn't. The reality is that much of D-Day was a beautiful failure, a series of mistakes, miscommunications, and improvisations that somehow added up to a stunning success. Take the naval bombardment before the beach landings. Allied warships fired thousands of shells at German positions, hoping to destroy bunkers and clear the way for infantry. But many of the shells missed entirely. Others bounced off reinforced concrete like pebbles. Some areas received no shelling at all because of poor visibility or navigational errors. Then there were the airborne drops, scattered far from their intended zones. Entire regiments were fragmented, sometimes never reuniting. Some paratroopers landed on top of enemy units. Others ended up in flooded fields or behind enemy lines with no support. One American general called it the worst drop in history, but it worked precisely because of the confusion it caused. Even the Allied maps were outdated. In one sector, soldiers stormed a position only to discover that a large German gun battery marked on the maps had been moved weeks earlier. Another group attacked what they thought was a heavily fortified bunker, only to find a farmhouse full of cows. Other stories were born from exaggeration or wishful thinking. Some reports claimed that German troops were completely surprised by the landings. In truth, they had been expecting an invasion, just not at Normandy. And even after it began, many in the German command believed it was a feint, a diversion before the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. This belief was so strong that Hitler refused to release key reinforcements for nearly 24 hours. When he finally did, the delay had cost the Germans their chance to repel the beachhead. There were also bizarre mistakes in Allied planning. One infamous example involved code names accidentally leaked to the public. Weeks before D-Day, words like Overlord, Mulberry, and Neptune began appearing in crossword puzzles in British newspapers. MI5 launched an investigation, fearing that their top-secret invasion plan had been exposed. Incredibly, it turned out to be coincidence. Though how such coincidences occurred remains one of D-Day's most surreal footnotes. Even the way we remember the beaches is shaped by simplification. We often hear about 5 beaches, but in reality, Each beach was subdivided into dozens of sectors, codenamed with bizarre labels: Dog Green, Easy Red, Fox White. Each had its own terrain, its own defenders, and its own story. And then there's the myth of uniform allied unity. In reality, many units were composed of mixed nationalities: Americans, Brits, Canadians, Poles, French, Belgians, Norwegians, and more. Language barriers often made coordination difficult. One Polish tank crew reportedly mistook an order and drove several miles into enemy lines, only realizing their mistake when the shooting stopped, and no one else had followed them. And let's not forget the odd superstitions and battlefield rituals. Some soldiers wore lucky charms, carried family photos, or scrawled prayers on their helmets. Others believed certain landing crafts
were cursed. One group of American GIs insisted on boarding a different boat after overhearing a sailor talk about his bad feeling. That boat later struck a mine. There were also strange and darkly comic incidents. In one case, Allied troops blew up a suspected enemy pillbox, only to discover it was an old French public toilet. In another, a British officer became so frustrated with a jammed machine gun that he beat it with a cricket bat he had carried ashore for morale. The weapon never fired, but the officer survived the day, later claiming the bat had deflected shrapnel. Meanwhile, behind the front lines, Allied censors worked overtime to control the narrative. Letters home were read, redacted, or destroyed. Journalists embedded with the troops were instructed not to report casualties or failures too clearly. The goal was clear: protect morale, maintain secrecy, and shape the story. And that story became legend. Newsreels showed heroic charges and clean victories. Posters proclaimed unity, valor, and destiny. But the real story of D-Day was more complicated. It was dirty, disorganized, and filled with chance. It was a war won not just by generals and plans, but by exhausted men digging in with bayonets, medics improvising surgery in barns, and engineers turning craters into roads. Perhaps the greatest myth of D-Day is that it was inevitable. It wasn't. It came within inches of failure, again and again, and yet it succeeded. Not because everything went right, but because enough people were brave, stubborn, or desperate enough to make it work anyway. History often polishes its stories. D-Day is no exception. But behind every clean map and heroic image lies 1,000 stories of error, confusion, and pure luck. And that, in many ways, is what makes it all the more human and all the more extraordinary. By mid-June, the beachheads at Normandy had stabilized. Towns like Carentan, Bayeux,
and Caen, previously quiet corners of rural France, were now at the center of an unfolding military drama. The initial chaos of D-Day had begun to give way to more traditional warfare, set-piece battles, artillery duels, and slow, grueling advances through the countryside. But not all the battles were fought in plain sight. Some of the most bizarre and least remembered victories happened far from the front lines, in forests, fields, and basements. Take the Hedgerow War, for example. Normandy's terrain was unlike anything many Allied troops had ever encountered. The landscape was a patchwork of small fields, separated by dense, centuries-old hedgerows, walls of earth and vegetation sometimes taller than a man and thicker than a tank. These weren't just obstacles, they were natural fortresses. German troops used the hedgerows to devastating effect, setting up ambushes, machine gun nests, and mortar positions. Every advance became a slog through narrow gaps, blind corners, and sniper fire. Entire battalions could be held back by a single field. The Allies had to improvise. American engineers created hedgerow cutters by welding sharpened beams to the front of tanks, turning them into battering rams. These devices, known as rhino tanks, could plow through the thickets, exposing German positions and creating new paths for infantry. Still, progress was agonizingly
slow, and for every field gained, dozens of men could be lost. Amid the fighting, oddities abounded. In one instance, a German officer disguised as a French farmer was captured trying to infiltrate Allied lines. He was recognized not by his accent, but by his pristine boots, too clean for someone living in the mud. In another case, Allied troops advancing on a barn discovered it filled not with soldiers, but with German mannequins dressed in uniforms, posed behind windows and sandbags. It had been used to deceive aerial reconnaissance. From above, it looked like a fortified outpost. On the ground, it was a ghost garrison. Other ghostly encounters came in the form of booby traps. German troops, trained in psychological warfare, planted mines in everyday objects. Rifles rigged to explode when picked up. Helmets booby-trapped with grenades. Even corpses were occasionally wired with explosives, intended to maim medics and chaplains. In one particularly cruel twist, they left behind wounded soldiers who screamed for help, only for their bodies to be surrounded by tripwires or concealed mines. It created a moral and tactical dilemma: save a man and risk others, or leave him to die. And yet, even in the ugliest corners of war, moments of humanity persisted. Allied medics treated German wounded. German doctors surrendered and offered their services to both sides. Civilians brought water and blankets to whichever army held their town.
sometimes switching sides several times in a week. The front lines were never clear-cut. In some areas, combatants passed each other in the night without even realizing it. In others, small units became isolated for days, holding crossroads or farmhouses while cut off from all communication. These forgotten fronts were often the most brutal. No supplies, no reinforcements, just survival. And survival often meant scavenging. Soldiers on both sides raided abandoned homes for food, clothes, or anything of use. One British unit famously brewed tea, using water boiled over a fire made from Nazi propaganda posters. An American squad cooked stew in a Nazi officer's helmet. The surreal had become routine. The role of signals intelligence also grew in importance. Allied code breakers in Bletchley Park continued intercepting German communications, feeding critical information to commanders on the ground. But sometimes the intelligence was so precise that field officers didn't believe it. One such instance involved an intercepted message revealing the location of a German fuel depot. The airstrike request was denied by a skeptical colonel until his supply convoy was ambushed by tanks fueled from that very depot. But not all secret work involved radio signals. In towns and farms, French civilians passed notes, whispered troop movements, and signaled from rooftops. Children on bicycles served as couriers. Nuns hid maps under their habits. A famous case involved a blind man who passed coded information by tapping his cane on the ground in patterns as he walked by Allied scouts. And even while these stories unfolded, the weather continued its strange relationship with the war. A heat wave struck in late June, turning roads to dust and foxholes into oven. Troops swapped rain-soaked misery for sunstroke and dehydration. Equipment overheated, guns jammed, and in the haze, the lines between units blurred. More than once, friendly fire incidents occurred between sun-dazed soldiers who mistook movements in the shimmering heat for enemy attacks. Despite it all, the Allies advanced, inch by inch. Towns were liberated not in heroic charges, but in grinding, dusty battles that left buildings shattered and civilians dazed. Yet with every kilometer gained, the momentum shifted. German morale began to crack. Desertions increased. Resistance from local militias grew bolder. Surrender became a whisper in the air. And behind every step forward were the unsung players. Engineers rebuilding bridges under fire. Cooks serving meals in craters. Drivers ferrying the wounded, and radio operators sending frantic updates to headquarters. Their victories weren't marked on maps. They didn't make headlines, but they held the line, kept the lifeblood of the invasion flowing. and turned 1,000 small, silent efforts into a single, unstoppable force. As July dawned over the fields of Normandy, the beaches that had once roared with war began to quiet. The sand, churned and blackened by fire, was now littered with remnants, broken rifles, scorched helmets, empty boots, and notes never delivered. The Allied invasion had succeeded, but it left behind a strange, haunting landscape. D-Day did not end the war. It was just the beginning of a longer, bloodier push across France and into Germany, but the scale of its ambition and the odd patchwork way it unfolded would leave an imprint that would ripple through history. In the weeks following June 6th, Allied troops continued to pour into France through the beachhead. What had started as a narrow strip of sand was transformed into a logistical juggernaut. Temporary roads were laid. Airfields were carved from farmland. Entire towns were rebuilt to house troops, store supplies, and fuel the advance. Yet even as the war moved inland, the beaches remained surreal. Tourists and reporters began to arrive. War correspondents who had risked their lives during the landings now gave carefully curated reports from command tents and temporary studios. Generals posed for photos. Politicians visited. The front line began to merge with a growing narrative, a curated version of events streamlined for public consumption. Monuments were erected within weeks. Local cemeteries expanded. White crosses began to appear in symmetrical rows, dotting the coastline with the silent testimony of sacrifice. One field near Colville-Mer became the temporary resting place for over 9,000 Americans, a number that would only grow. And among the dead were stories never told. Men whose parachutes never opened, whose boats never reached shore, whose names were misspelled or lost in paperwork. Some soldiers who had survived the landings would never speak of them again. Others wrote journals, letters, or sketches of the chaos. A few became unofficial historians of their unit, carrying the responsibility of remembrance like a sacred burden. But the aftermath of D-Day was not only physical, it was psychological. Many who survived returned home bewildered. They had seen the strangest forms of death, carnage, and confusion. They had watched their friends drown next to them, then shared wine with liberated villagers hours later. They had fought in cow pastures, slept in shell holes, and celebrated victories without fully understanding them. For some, the surreal nature of D-Day became too much to reconcile. Post-war years brought silence, then nightmares, then a reluctant retelling. Some found purpose in sharing their experiences. Others buried them deep. Meanwhile, in Germany, the invasion marked a slow unraveling. The myth of invincibility was broken. German propaganda struggled to explain the sheer scale of the assault. Internal divisions widened. High-ranking officers were interrogated. Some were executed. Others, like Field Marshal Rommel, were implicated in plots against Hitler and forced to commit suicide. The ripple effect of June 6th was global. It accelerated the liberation of Western Europe. It reshaped alliances. It forced a confrontation with fascism on a scale that could no longer be ignored. And it forever changed how wars would be fought, from the use of amphibious tactics and deception to the global coordination of intelligence and logistics. And yet, for all its gravity, D-Day is still remembered with elements of strangeness. In Sainte-Mère-Église, the dummy of Private John Steele, dangling from the church steeple, still swings during annual commemorations. In fields near Gold Beach, fragments of flail tanks are preserved like relics. In Normandy's hedgerows, farmers still dig up spent bullets and rusted dog tags while tending their crops. Modern-day reenactments and museum exhibits tell the story in polished detail. But if you walk the beaches alone, you can still feel the strange silence that lingers. The tide washes in and out, touching places where teenagers once died and where others began to live again. Even nature carries memory. Some coastal plants are said to have changed due to the chemicals and metals left in the soil from the bombardment. Birds nest in pillboxes. Trees grow around shrapnel, and the myths persist. Every year, new theories emerge about secret missions, missing units, or the real reasons for certain decisions. Some are true, others are fantasy, but all speak to the same thing. D-Day is too massive, too strange, too deeply human to ever be fully contained by textbooks. It was at once the most meticulously planned and most chaotically executed operation in military history. It was a battlefield of contradictions, horror and hope, tragedy and comedy, order and madness. It was a day when fate was decided by weather, by miscommunication, by the odd glint of a lucky coin in a soldier's pocket. A day when lives saved lives. When silence screamed louder than bombs. When ordinary men, placed in the most extraordinary circumstances, acted with courage they didn't know they had. And now, as the waves continue to lap against Normandy's shores, the bizarre history of D-Day reminds us that victory isn't always clean or logical. It's made of improvisation, resilience, and the moments that make no sense until they're stitched together into something greater than the sum of their parts. D-Day wasn't just a turning point in war. It was proof that even in the darkest hours, humanity's strangest, messiest, most unpredictable efforts can shape the course of history.